Hi there and welcome to the channel, and in this video I'll be talking about Joseph Conrad's short novel The Shadow Line, published in 1916. But before coming on to that, a brief note: this is the second Conrad novel I reviewed for the channel, the previous one being Under Western Eyes. Now The Shadow Line is nothing like as ambitious or poetic as that work, but for that very reason it may prove a more suitable point of entry for anyone looking to get into Conrad. Right, having said that, I'll begin with a summary of this strongly autobiographical novel. The book opens in an eastern seaport with an act of youthful folly on the part of the unnamed narrator, who signs off from his post on a steamship where he has greatly impressed the captain, takes up residence in a sailor's home, and informs anyone bold enough to ask that he is intent upon returning to England. In this home are a conniving steward, an arrogant, dissolute English seaman, and a benevolent and well-respected older man, Captain Giles. In this first part of the book, we see the young man's inflated opinion of himself, his haughty and dismissive treatment of others, and his indecision over his future, until this unflattering portrait is brought to an end by a seeming miracle, orchestrated it would seem by Captain Giles, the fairy godmother of this tale, as the young man is summoned by the harbour master to assume command of a sailing ship which is waiting for him near Singapore. Having a ship under his command produces an unexpected and profound change in the young man's status, and he daydreams about how easily he will transition to the role of captain and all the pleasant days he will spend on the open seas, and this fantasy is further strengthened when he reaches his destination and finds his ship to be one of great beauty, seemingly perfect in every respect. What follows is the absolute crushing of this fantasy, as the captain's first voyage is slowly overtaken by disaster. Simply put, he can't get the ship to move. Firstly, there is a bureaucratic wrangle that he must go through before the ship can leave port, and then, out on the open sea, he simply cannot find a breath of wind. The ship becomes becalmed, and in this pestilential atmosphere, sickness and fever rip through the crew. This section bears a striking parallel to Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There is even a figure on board comparable to He Who Stoppeth One of Three, Burns, the mate, who insists that the ship has been cursed by the dead captain who went mad, and whose corpse Burns himself helped push overboard. Balancing the malign presence of Burns is the graceful figure of Ransom, who is instrumental in keeping up the captain's spirits and seeing the voyage to completion. In a happy ending of sorts, the captain receives approbation for having brought the ship to port without any fatalities in the face of such challenging circumstances. The benevolent Captain Giles reappears unchanged, while the younger man who greets him has been thoroughly transformed by his experience. He has crossed the shadow line. Okay, so there's the story, and this seems a natural point at which to provide a quote. I've chosen a moment towards the end of the novel, a crucial moment when the captain is awaiting the onset of a storm which will either drive the ship to safety or send it to the bottom of the sea. I thought that all my feelings had been dulled into complete indifference, but I found it as trying as ever to be on deck. The impenetrable blackness beset the ship so close that it seemed that by thrusting one's hand over the side, one could touch some unearthly substance. There was in it an effect of inconceivable terror and of inexpressible mystery. The few stars overhead shed a dim light upon the ship alone, with no gleams of any kind upon the water, in detached shafts piercing an atmosphere which had turned to soot. It was something I had never seen before, giving no hint of the direction from which any change would come, the closing in of a menace from all sides. There was still no man at the helm. The immobility of all things was perfect. If the air had turned black, the sea, for all I knew, might have turned solid. It was no good looking in any direction, watching for any sign, speculating upon the nearness of the moment. When the time came, the blackness would overwhelm silently, the bit of starlight falling upon the ship, and the end of all things would come without a sigh, stir, or murmur of any kind, and all our hearts would cease to beat like run-down clocks. It was impossible to shake off that sense of finality. The quietness that came over me was like a foretaste of annihilation. It gave me a sort of comfort, as though my soul had become suddenly reconciled to an eternity of blind stillness. As well as being beautiful in their own right, such passages by placing the human drama against the backdrop of an indifferent, purposeless universe, underscored the moral position Conrad assumes in The Shadow Line, that in such a world, to prevail must be a collaborative enterprise. No individual act of heroism on the captain's part will carry the day. Instead, it's his preparedness to accept assistance and the unstinting efforts of the crew which will lead them ultimately to safety. As you may have gathered by now, I greatly enjoyed this novel. I find the sombre atmosphere pervading Conrad's work extremely compelling, and after finishing The Shadow Line, I was asking myself, which writer does he most remind me of? And purely by intuition, I lighted upon the name of Marguerite Duras, whom coincidentally I've also made a number of videos about. And having made this connection, I was astonished to find this in Laurie Adler's biography of Duras. She loved Conrad and would read him over and over again all through her life. So there we have it. My connection was not as fanciful as it at first seemed. And to conclude this review, I'd like to touch briefly upon 3 points of similarity between these two great writers, which may go some way towards explaining the attraction they hold for me. Firstly, both Conrad and Duras are products of colonialism, of imperialism. Conrad of the British Empire, Duras of the French, and they are both outsiders too. Conrad due to his Polish birth, and Duras on account of growing up in poverty on the periphery. And it's this combination of perspectives, that of the insider and the outsider, that lends their work a special depth. Secondly, there's an erotic aspect to the work of both these writers. What you won't find in The Shadow Line, though, is the kind of open treatment of sexuality one frequently encounters in Duras's novels. Instead, Conrad presents masculinity as a task requiring endless vigilance to avoid those dangers by which one may be unmanned, emotionally by relationships with women, physically by engaging in homosexual activity, or mentally by succumbing to madness. In this all-male world, each glance, each remark, each gesture carries a potentially deeper significance, a state of affairs that understandably breeds an atmosphere of mutual suspicion. And by way of example, here's a quote from a confrontation between the captain and Burns, where the latter man effectively unmans himself, invoking his wife and children as a justification for his not having acted more forcefully. "Look here, Mr. Burns," I began very firmly. "You may as well understand that I did not run after this command. It was pushed in my way. I've accepted it. I'm here to take the ship home first of all, and you may be sure that I shall see to it that every one of you on board here does his duty to that end. This is all I have to say, for the present." He was on his feet by this time, but instead of taking his dismissal, he remained with trembling, indignant lips, and looking at me hard as though really, after this, there was nothing for me to do in common decency but to vanish from his outraged sight. Like all very simple emotional states, this was moving. I felt sorry for him, almost sympathetic, till, seeing that I did not vanish, he spoke in a tone of forced restraint. "If I hadn't a wife and child at home, you may be sure, sir, I would have asked you to let me go the very minute you came on board." I answered him with a matter-of-course calmness, as though some remote third person were in question. "And I, Mr. Burns, would not have let you go. You have signed the ship's articles as chief officer. Until they are terminated at the final port of discharge, I shall expect you to attend to your duty and give me the benefit of your experience to the best of your ability." Stony incredulity lingered in his eyes, but it broke down before my friendly attitude. With a slight upward toss of his arms, I got to know that gesture well afterwards. He bolted out of the cabin. Finally, both Conrad and Duras are great rewriters of their experiences. The Shadow Line is the final and richest rewriting of an experience which is touched upon in Lord Jim, The End of the Tether, Folk, The Secret Sharer, and A Smile of Fortune, while Duras wrote The Lover, deep into old age, which rewrote the childhood experiences she portrayed in her novel The Seawall, published some 40 years previously. And what this rewriting does, once again, is add further depth to their work. So there we have it, two writers for the price of one, as it were. And before I go, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but if you haven't yet done so, please check out the Discord server I've created. It's a great place to discuss the the books I talk about on the channel, to share your own book hauls, your own reviews, and basically to enjoy being part of a wonderful, if small, community. Come on over and check it out. The link is in the description. And now, time calls, and I must bid you farewell in the customary fashion. Until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.